What's up, Cougar Nation, and welcome again aboard the Hype Train podcast. I'm your host, Joe Wheat. That's out, Joe Wheat27 on Twitter, as always, with my boys, Hunter Miller and Trevor Levitt. Brethren, I have the blackout jersey on. We're cleansing the timeline. Hunter is sad, also wearing black. Trevor is just his royal blue giddy self as he always is.
What the frick? What the frick? What are we doing? What am I to do now?
My first question is, what the heck? Second question is, where do you get off?
Third question.
Where can I find a new TV?
Not at old Max Hall's house.
Crying, screaming, throwing up at midnight on Saturday night.
Hunter wasn't at the game, but Trevor,
no,
was that the quietest you've ever heard Lavelle Edwards Stadium?
It was. I mean, it would have been if there were fans around us stomping around a little bit, but yeah, it was pretty quiet.
That was actually me. That's my bad.
If Joe Wheat hadn't been cursing in your ear, it may have been the quietest.
It made it all the worse that one of my coworkers was sitting right behind me, and I had no idea until I get to the office today, and my boss shows says, "Is this you?" The picture of me just so sad after the game.
Pausing, Alex Ovechkin just scored a second goal against Utah tonight, and the fact that do not ever question my dedication to this podcast when I'm here recording when I could have been watching Alex Ovechkin play hockey in Utah. I got the Ovechkin jersey back there.
Oh man,
if you're watching on YouTube.
I didn't realize I was in Utah, dude.
It's in Utah. Jackson is there. I was supposed to go with Jackson. This guy. Again, we'll get back to BYU. There's a small portion of BYU fans that get very upset on the YouTube channel when we go off base and talk a little hockey, talk a little puck. Jackson, a month ago, was like, "Hey, do you want to go to the game?" Because he's a DC kid. I grew up in Washington, DC. He's like, "Do you want to go to the Capitals game when they come here to Utah?" I was like, "Yeah, if tickets aren't ridiculously expensive, I'm down." I then a few days ago texted him being like, "Hey, you're going to the game?" And he's like, "Yep." And I was like, "Did you already get tickets?" And he's like, "Yeah." It gave me the section number. Now he's going with his wife. I thought bro night at the Capitals Utah game. I go to my wife. I'm like, "Hey, hockey game, Alex Ovechkin in town. You in?" And she said, "Absolutely not." First she said, "How much are tickets?" And I said, $70 each. And she said, "Definitely not. No interest. Will not go. And I'm not going to go to a hockey game by myself. What am I, crazy?" So Jackson is at this game watching Alex Ovechkin. I'm sitting here recording podcasts, talking ball. And that's the last thing we'll say about puck. Although Alex Ovechkin chasing Wayne Gretzky for the all-time leading goals record, which was the equivalent, that hockey's equivalent of Wilt Chamberlain 100-point game, where when Gretzky set the record, it was this is an unbreakable record. And now here, Ovechkin's going to break it. And I could have seen him score 2 goals in Salt Lake City, but Jackson decided to buy tickets without me. So
again,
how's your weekend going, fellas?
First of all, I am extremely sorry for your loss. Second of all, I can't believe I had to miss the hockey game to record my podcast. Might be the widest 30-year-old sentence in the history of ever.
Not 30 though. So am I the only one that's not 30 on this?
No, I'm 20. I'm 29. But man, do I feel 30. Man, do I feel 30.
I can't believe I couldn't go to see Alex Ovechkin because I had a talk on my sports ball podcast. BYU loses. The Patriots lose. The Bruins stink. I can't go see Alex Ovechkin. Yegor Demon's my saving grace right now. Him and Jason Tatum. That's what I got going. And Baby Do in a couple months.
But aside from those things, where do we even start with this?
Well, Joe, I think we go back to when Alex Ovechkin first came over from Russia. The fans on YouTube would be so mad if we actually started down that path.
So Hunter so far has mentioned 2 athletes, Alexander Ovechkin and Yegor Demon, which makes me think that is Hunter a Russian plug?
Am I a comrade on this podcast? Where are my comrades at?
Our podcast.
It's, I mean, and Patriots stink, and the commies from DC.
Speaking of,
I'm just saying,
they're taking over.
The commies are taking over our beloved NFL.
Over.
Actually, they were, and the Eagles, a ragtag bunch of Philadelphians, put that to rest.
Hey, not the first time the East Coast has fought off invaders, right?
If I had a nickel for every time a ragtag bunch of Philadelphians fought off the commies, we're off the rails.
This is the giddiest the podcast has ever started, and we lost
after a loss.
It's one of those like laugh until you cry kind of moments. Like
we're laughing through the pain.
Yeah, hide the pain in the eyes.
I was in a terrible mood. Like you said, I did not go to the game. I watched it on TV. I don't know what the energy was like in the stadium. The looks of devastation on BYU fans after the fact was, hurts you right in the heart. I think I just sat. So I was sick all weekend, which means when I'm sick, I sleep up here. So if you can see for our YouTube audience, like this has been my makeshift bed on the futon, just right behind me, because I don't want to get my wife sick, especially because she's 7 months pregnant. Also, this is like my man cave, if you want to call it. So I got the TV in here watching the BYU game, and game ended. I turned off the TV, and I think I just sat in silence for probably 45 minutes. Just like stewing. I said some not nice things about a certain offensive coordinator. I won't say what position he coaches, but a certain coach.
It was A-Rod.
I won't name names, and I won't say what position he coaches. It was Aaron Roderick and the offensive coordinator. Just like I said some not nice things in the text chat, but I take back what I said. I don't take back the feelings that were behind them,
which is fair. I
don't take back the things that I said.
I mean, of all the, first let's kind of summarize what we saw. If you didn't watch the game, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast. We appreciate we appreciate the engagement, like, subscribe, do all those things.
Maybe our Russian audience will tune out for this part.
I want to hear if you've come around at all on any, like, how your views have evolved on the game since Sunday. My takeaway from the game was BYU's defense is amazing. They held Jalen Daniels and arguably, I would say, probably a top 3 offense in the conference to 17 points, 7 of which came off of literally a BYU player's helmet. Held them to like 100 yards underneath their average rushing, 100 yards underneath their average yards per game. Just incredible numbers.
That said it was like their season low in basically every statistical category.
Right. So the defense balled. There's not a whole lot of interesting stuff that we can add there, except for maybe like there were a couple deep shots that were hit on, but one of those involved an offensive pass interference that wasn't called. So really, like, no complaints about the defense whatsoever. Offense. So this is where the discussion gets interesting, because I'm of the opinion that the offense played well 90% of the game. The 10% that they didn't play well was the most important part, and that's why BYU lost.
By most important part, are you talking about inside like the 30-yard line?
Yes,
because they're
inside the
between
red
the 30s.
Because
which is the same. It's the same story as the Utah game, right? Like the difference is that BYU did not have a special teams or defensive score in this game. It offensively was the same story.
I think it's a little different from the Utah game. Again, like, if we want to get into the nerdy metrics here, BYU averaged almost a full play more, like a full yard more per play than they did against Utah. And they gained, I think, like 61% of available yards versus like 35% against Utah. So like it's a different type of offensive performance, but the red zone struggles yielded the same results. Like, it doesn't matter if you can drive the ball, Stats of War does like the success rate thing. One stat that he created is called Eckle rate, which is basically like when you have a drive, what's the percentage of times that you get it into scoring possession, meaning like inside the red zone. BYU is 8th in Eckle rate, meaning 50% of the time they get the ball, they get into scoring position, which is 8th best in the country. In points per scoring drive like that, they are 96th in the country, if that makes any sense to you. But basically, it's basically what that stat says is BYU is better than anybody at getting close to scoring without going all the way. And that is incredibly fitting, is it not?
Inappropriate joke.
Sorry for that segment of the audience.
That's on you. I'm going to give you a quick game synopsis. BYU offense moves the ball down the field, gets into scoring territory, settles for a field goal. BYU offense moves the ball down the field, gets into a scoring opportunity, settles for a field goal. BYU moves the ball down just before the half. The craziest brain dead mistake you'll ever see leads them to getting 0 points before halftime. BYU goes down, scores a touchdown, and that's my offensive recap to you. Which game am I referring to? Right? Was it Kansas game or was it Utah game? Because it's both. Like, that was the story of both games. I understand that like the stats might be a little bit different, but again, we're talking about a team that was able to, that the defense got stop after stop when they needed to get stops, and the offense would move the ball. Yes, like they'd gain their available yards and they do this and that and get their numbers so that they can rank in the Jekyll and Hyde, Josh Heupel, whatever rating. And then they would fail to actually convert and move the ball when it mattered most. So they'd settle for a field goal, which then put more pressure on the defense to, we have to get a stop. If we don't stop them, they're going to score, and then the game's out of hand. Like, that was the reality of both games. The difference was in the Utah game, BYU got a special teams touchdown. They didn't get one of those in this game against Kansas. And like, for whatever reason, the offense seems to have been sleepwalking really since the first half of UCF. So the last 10 quarters of football, I think they have like 3 offensive touchdowns. It's just frustrating as a BYU fan because, like, Joe, and we can get into it more, but like you made the point and others made the point. Garrett McClintock on Twitter was the one that I think first tweeted out, where it's like, you don't fire an offensive coordinator when you're winning. And BYU the last couple of weeks has won, I think, despite the offense and despite the offensive play calling, which to me, and the point that I made in our text threads this week, was that sounds an awful lot like the situation BYU faced on the defensive side of the ball following the 20, 21, and 22 seasons. They were doing a lot of winning. They won, I think, 11, 10, and 8 games in those 3 seasons. By all means and metrics, 3 very successful seasons, 2 of the most successful seasons BYU has had since, the 06 to 09 Mountain West Max Hall, John Beck years. And yet you could tell that they were winning despite one facet of the team and the roster. And, you could say one facet of the coaching staff. And I'm not going to sit here and say fire Aaron Roderick after one loss. But what I am going to say is I think that it deserves maybe more conversation than shrugging it off because BYU is 9-1. And that I think there is actual conversations that can and maybe should be had, will be had on a podcast platform, which ultimately is meaningless and nobody cares. It's not like Kalani Sitake is listening to this podcast and being like, you know what, some very good points are being made. I will or I won't fire Aaron Roderick. But I do think conversations need to be had, within the team of, clearly the offense has run into an issue the last little while. I do think that there's a trend within the BYU football team and with the offense specifically, that they absolutely shred teams that are very, very, very bad defenses, right? Like they scored in the 30s against Baylor, terrible defense. They scored in the 30s against Oklahoma State, 111th ranked scoring defense in the country. They scored, a lot of points against UCF and against Arizona, also both very bad defenses. When they face any offense that is ranked better than 75 and 75th in the country in opponent points per game, they've scored a total of 18 against SMU. And this is, again, it's offense because BYU scored a special teams touchdown, but they scored 15 offensive points against Utah. They scored 13 offensive points against Kansas, and they scored 24 offensive points against Kansas State, which I think we can agree, like the defense did a lot of the heavy lifting for the offense in that Kansas State game because their offensive touchdown drives were like 27, 28, 34 yards. So when we're talking about an offense, like, yes, they've had success against really bad defenses, but when they're facing any sort of moderate challenge on the defensive side of the ball, they cannot get the ball into the end zone. And I think despite BYU winning, it's fair to address the elephant in the room. That is, there's something lacking on the offensive side of the ball.
No, I think you've made a good point in that. That's obviously like flip side, and I don't want to jump the gun here because we'll talk about Arizona State later, but you look at just we were talking about it in the group chat earlier today, just the disparity between who they've been playing and who they played the last couple of weeks. The UCF, like the second half of the UCF game is tough for me because that game was just so clearly over that anything in the second half for me, it's hard to throw that in with Aaron Roderick's like struggles the last couple of weeks, or the offensive struggles, I should say, the last couple of weeks. But it is tough to justify like the results of the last couple of weeks too, when we're wanting BYU to do like what they have the potential still to do. And I'll talk even about that later. But like, if we want BYU to win like the conference championship game, like if they make it there, they beat Arizona State, they beat Houston, and let's say they play Colorado. Like, as good as our defense is, like our offense is going to have to put up points. And that Colorado defense, like Hunter mentioned earlier, like not fantastic, but not bad. And Arizona State, even this week, not great, not bad either. And so what is BYU doing these next couple of weeks to change and excel even against teams that are good at defense? Because that's what the teams that win conference championships do. That's what teams that make any sort of noise in the college football playoff, like that's what they do. Like, you just have to find ways to score, and most specifically you have to find ways to score touchdowns, which we haven't been able to do. Will Ferrell's great. I would like to see less of Will Ferrell because we need to, like, at least less of Will Ferrell from the standpoint of like kicking extra points rather than field goals. And so there's a part of me that you can't get rid of Roderick at the moment. Like, things are working. There were parts of that Kansas game that were really fluky. That punt from Daniels was one of the greatest punts, / worst things I've ever seen in my entire life. Aaron Roderick talked about it.
Maybe not coolest, but craziest.
Yeah, craziest.
Like, as a BYU fan, not cool at all.
Not cool at all. But like,
I hated that very much.
Yeah, but like, as far as like from a kicker or from a quarterback to be able to like just fluky, weird, like we heard words like that before. It just wasn't for us today. That Saturday, the offense has to get better, and I think this Arizona State game is a great way for them to be able to kind of prove that they're working on things, that they're going to, finish drives. And they're going to have to be better because Arizona State will beat us if we don't.
Just for reference, BYU's remaining schedule in opponents' points per game. Arizona State ranks 42nd, allowing 22.8 points per game. Houston is 38th in the country, 22.5 points per game. And Colorado, a potential Big 12 championship matchup, is 36th at 22.3. So like the defenses remaining on this BYU schedule are really, really good at not allowing the opposing team to get into the end zone and to put points on the board. And again, like it's on par with Utah, right? Like Utah's 40th, 22.6. And really the next closest is Kansas is 49, or Kansas State is 49th. So they're going to be playing probably, the best defenses that they've played all season, with maybe you could say the exception of Utah, because Utah's numbers are probably skewed by giving up 49 points to Colorado this last week. With the exception of maybe Utah, like your best three defenses that you're going to play all season are, for sure in the next two games, if you make it to the conference championship and you do face Colorado might, be the best, which is a crazy thing to say when we came into the season, because last year Colorado defense was very much not good. Had a rocky start to the season, lost to Nebraska. They lost to Kansas State. They almost lost to North Dakota. North Dakota or North Dakota State, either one. But they've, started to gel, and the transfers on that defensive side of the ball have really gotten into a rhythm. So now's the time for your offense to, if it does end up being a wake-up call, this Kansas game, and, Roderick can get the offense back on track, and the BYU defense can continue to be as good as they've been the last few weeks. Like, I'm not worried about Arizona State and Houston, and, to a lesser degree, because I'm a little more worried about Colorado, just because they look really, really good lately. But like, now's the time. And I'm glad it did happen right now, as opposed to, maybe the Arizona State game where a tiebreaker for the Big 12 comes into play, or, even in the Big 12 championship game. So I'm glad that the wake-up call is happening now, rather than sleepwalking to the finish line and then suddenly getting punched in the mouth and not having any time to react.
Where do I go from here? We're
kind of all over the map, but
all of you guys make some really good points. I think it's the fire Roderick discussion at this point isn't a productive one, because it's not going to happen. Like, we can dream about it. You can fantasize about it all you want. It's not going to happen this offseason, mostly because the last 2 weeks have sucked. Don't get me wrong, as far as especially red zone execution, but the results, his results since he's been the BYU offensive coordinator, in my opinion, just don't merit his firing. When he took over in 2020, they were first in yards per play. 2021, they were fifth in yards per play. 2022, they were 16th in yards per play. 2023, they fell all the way back to 115th in the transition, and now they're all the way back to 40th. So we can talk about 2023 all you want. In my opinion, the only way Aaron Roderick was going to get fired was if he repeated the 2023 performance. I think if at the beginning of the year you told any BYU fan, hey, we're going to be top 40 in every offensive metric, I think people would have been thrilled with that. I get that expectations changed. What's that?
I said, is it all?
Well, yeah, they're again, in terms of EPA per play, offense is 37th. In red zone scoring, offense is 32nd. In yards per play, offense is 40th, I think.
Offensive touchdowns per game.
But here's the problem. I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like those metrics, only because I prefer per play, per drive metrics, because BYU's pace of play is so slow. And that's where we can get into the discussion where I actually agree with you, Hunter, is that my biggest issue with Aaron Roderick is the way that he calls a football game. Pace is a huge issue. Aaron Roderick has no problem with the offense getting 8 possessions a game. That's a really low number. Right now, BYU is, I think, 105th in the country in plays per game. That's a really low number. And when you have that, when you have that low of a number, touchdowns per game is going to be low just because they don't have as many opportunities as the next team. I've ad nauseum, I've talked about the 40-point mark with this BYU offense, and they rarely hit it under Roderick because, again, their pace of play, you have to play perfectly on offense to get above that 40-point mark. Like 8 drives, if BYU scored a touchdown on every drive, they would have scored 56 points. Do you know how many offenses have scored 56 points this year? A lot. But again, like my biggest issue with Aaron Roderick is that he seems to value game control and ball control more than he values points, which is fine when you're at UCF and you're up 34-10 in the second half. And like really the game at that point is controlling the clock like they were in the second half. That's fine against Oklahoma State, where Oklahoma State's offense is cooking us and BYU's defense actually needs a break. And so you can go on these elongated drives where every single play is a run. Like that's an option there. When you can't do it is in a tied football game coming out of the half, the defense is already rested. Like on Coordinator's Corner, he talked about, giving the defense a good rest on that 10-minute drive. They were already rested. Like they literally went an hour of real time before drives.
I did the math, 54 minutes between like actual live snaps. There was one snap, which was a Kansas kneel down to end the first half, but you ended the half essentially on a BYU drive. Then you went to halftime for 20, 25 minutes. And then you came out and had a 10-minute football time drive. Like the defense had sat on the bench for an hour. And you guys were at the game. What was it? 15 degrees? Like a rest is like 10, 15 minutes. An hour is like, that's like a rain delay where like have to go 100%. Back to the locker room because there's lightning in the area, and you come back out and they give you like 15 minutes to warm up. Before you have to play again. Like the defense needed almost like a mini practice on the sideline with how long they had just been sitting there and not playing.
Well, and the other thing is like, I get that if you're getting cooked, but that was not the case. Like BYU's defense after that first drive, Kansas couldn't do anything on offense.
I also get it if you're coming out with a 14-point lead at halftime.
Right. Like again, that totally makes sense. But all that drive did is it resulted in a field goal, which is devastating. Like if you go down and score a touchdown there, sure, that you can call that a success. But just kicking a field goal there, what you've done is you've given Kansas the ball back, just about to start the fourth quarter in a 1-possession game. And now your offense has to play perfect to win. And that's the part that is frustrating to me, is when it's that tight, that like you've assured that Kansas was going to be in that game late. There was nothing like to be honest with you guys, this is going to sound like sour grapes or like classic BYU fan, whatever. BYU, I came away thinking BYU was the better team. Watching those two teams play, I felt that Kansas was very fortunate to win that game. And BYU has won a lot of games that way. It has won some games that way this year. But of all the close games BYU has played, this is the one I actually thought BYU like kind of dominated in some ways. Like you were +1, I think you were +1.2 in yards per play, which is a massive number. Your available yards percentage was like +15%. Like you like BYU demolished Kansas in this game, but because they couldn't execute situationally, they lost. And so that's where I'm not as doom and gloom after this loss going forward, just because like last year when BYU was bad at offense, it was because they were bad at absolutely everything. Like in other years when we've seen BYU be bad at offense, it's because they were bad at absolutely everything. This BYU team at least gets in a position to score. And then once you're down in that position, execution just becomes all the more important. And so like the goal line fade, horrible play call, but also horribly executed. That was the worst goal line fade I think I've ever seen thrown in my entire life. Like we can criticize A-Rod all we want, but Jake deserves 50% of the blame for even putting that ball in a place that it can get intercepted. So that play for me is execution. The 3rd and 6 speed option at the end of the game. You can argue with that play call all you want, but with the look that they got, BYU has run that play over and over and over again this year. And they blocked it really well, except for one player, Darius. Darius completely blew the block, and the play got blown up for no gain. Like those are plays that, like again, the goal line fade, inexcusable. Not even going to try. But like there are other plays in the red zone it's not that necessarily that I thought they were bad play calls. It was just really poor execution, which again comes back to the coaching staff, like absolutely. But when I hear people say, Aaron Roderick is a great play designer, not a great play caller, I disagree with that because again, the numbers don't really back that up. But game management wise, I fundamentally disagree with how he manages a game, like spiking the ball on first down when you have
wild.
58 seconds
left and 2 timeouts.
58 seconds left on the clock.
1 minute and 2 timeouts.
Two timeouts.
Let's just kill it down.
So again, like if your strategy, and that makes sense, but it's just not it's not a cohesive strategy, because at the end of the first half, you're all about, okay, let's score fast. Let's just score. Who cares how much time we give to Jalen Daniels and his team? Because if you, again, throwing with 50 seconds left on the clock, odds are, even if you score, Jalen Daniels still has a chance to go out and get Kansas in scoring position with 50 seconds left. So if that, I get it, if that was the strategy, but then you come out in the second half and you start playing like you're scared of Kansas's offense. And at the end of the game, you go into clock control mode after ripping off 3 plays for like 70 yards. And now all of a sudden it becomes about controlling the clock. And before you know it, it's 4th and 6. Like that's where I don't understand it, is just I said it in the group chat, like Aaron Roderick calls an offense like he's log rolling. If you've ever seen like a lumberjack games kind of situation where he the entire goal is to just throw the opponent off their game. And so it goes really, really fast and then he stops, then really, really fast and then he slows down, goes really, really fast. And sometimes that works and you throw your opponent off the log. And this time A-Rod threw himself off. And that's kind of the story.
Can I counter to the good play caller?
Sure.
First counter, yes, Jake threw a terrible pass. I would say it's 60-40, 60 on Roderick, because Jake's thrown that pass, one other time this season?
Twice,
aside from the interception?
Well, so he threw it on the 2-point conversion against SMU that also hit the DB in the hands.
So he's thrown it 3 times. He's thrown it 3 times this season. One, SMU hits the DB in the hands. Second time, 2-point conversion against Utah, it's intercepted. Why are you thinking
the DB in the chest?
Why are you thinking the third time is going to be like, this time it's going to work? We're going to put our second string tight end out there on an island against who got the interception? Do you even remember?
Oh, I don't
it
remember. Wasn't Kobe, was it?
It just says Brett's off pass intercepted. Either way, like, it's experienced Kansas defensive backs. Like, they showed the graphic on the broadcast, like the 2 most experienced defensive backs in the country, 2 most interceptions between a cornerback tandem. And you're like, let's put our backup tight end on an island out against these DBs. And let's expect Jake to throw this end zone fade from the 5-yard line.
In 20-degree weather.
In 20-degree weather, when he has not thrown it successfully, I think, in his entire career. And the 2 other times he's done it this season, one should have been intercepted and the other one was intercepted. And the third one was intercepted too. Who could have seen that coming? The second thing that I will say.
Can I counter your counter with another counter?
Yes.
You sent it. So on that same play, you sent us a screenshot of Chase Roberts on the backside running a slant, wide the freak open.
Yeah.
So again,
problem
like,
is,
to me, that comes down to making the right read, which I guess, like, Jake's argument for that was he didn't see a safety over the top, didn't have safety help, and he thought his guy could go make a play.
Yes.
Like, they were open. Like,
if he threw a ball that he could make a play on.
Right. So, but
make a play on this.
Your point, like,
throws it directly to the cornerback.
To your point, like, you got to run it there. Like, you're gashing him on the ground. LJ Martin has 0 touches inside the 10-yard line the last 2 games. Like, what are we doing? It's
going back to your first counter, because you're now getting into my second counter. Countering your counter to my counter. Lane Lunt was in the responses to the hype train, said, like, this is a quarterback. He gets there. He knows it's a fade. It's the play call. Depending on what the coverage is by the defense, he's supposed to either, go to the right to Taavasa fade, or if it's, I think, zone coverage, he's supposed to go to the slant routes that are happening on the left. To which I would say, because I was like, oh yeah, like, it was a called fade. fades, it's all about timing. Like if you wait half a second too long, the receiver is going to run out the back of the end zone, or the cornerback is going to catch up to him. Like you have to time an end zone corner fade exactly right. So I do not blame Jake for missing a wide open. Don't know if it was Chase or if it was Keelan. I do not blame him.
It was Keelan, but yeah, doesn't really matter, to be honest.
I do not blame him for missing a wide open Keelan, because if the call is to go to the fade route on the right, he does not have time to even take so much as half a second glance to his left. He's got to get the ball and go right the entire time. So I don't blame him for missing the wide receiver. It's a called fade. He has to go to the right. All that. Lane was saying, like, he gets there, it's the play call. Jake is supposed to determine what coverage the defense is in. If they're in man, he's supposed to go to the fade. They were in man, he goes to the fade. Fine. Like, that's true. But that's still the call that Roderick is making, where it's like, this is the play call, and Jake knows that with this play call, there are two options, depending on the coverage. That doesn't change the fact that it was Aaron Roderick putting them in a position at all to even have to go to that fade route on the right-hand side. So whether it was Jake reading the coverage and that's the way he decided to go or not, like, it's still on Roderick for making that play call.
No, I agree. I agree.
Going back to running the ball, Casey Lundquist tweeted out, BYU had the ball twice inside the Kansas 10-yard line in the first half and ended with 3 points. LJ Martin, who up to that point was averaging 7.2 yards per carry, had 0 touches inside the Kansas 10-yard line in the first half. 0 touches on 2 possessions inside the 10, including at the 5-yard line. You had it in a goal-to-go 5-yard line with a whole minute left.
And 2 timeouts.
There was, on the interception, I want to get the exact numbers right because it's how crazy it is. You had a 1st and goal, 40 seconds left, 2 timeouts at the Kansas 5-yard line with a running back who to that point was averaging 7.2 yards per carry. Now, simple math will tell you if you're at the 5-yard line and your running back's averaging 7.2 yards per carry, he's not going to get tackled until he's 2.2 yards into the end zone. Why on earth, with 2 timeouts, would you not at least try on 1st and goal from the 5 to give it to your running back with 40 seconds left? It's banana land. 100%. Like, that's the time when you are in that position. Yes, you run the ball on 1st down, you see what you can get. If you get down to the 1-yard line, you call a timeout, and guess what? You now at 30 seconds, you got a chance to go one more run before you need to go into the air twice more. Now, if he runs for no gain on 1st and 5, and now you're looking at 2nd and 5, and you have to use a timeout, now it gets a little more interesting. Do you run it? You still have that timeout, keep the defense on your toes, or do you pass? But to not even like give LJ a chance inside the 10-yard line on 2 different possessions in which you come away with 3 points is coaching malpractice. And it's crazy that, like, the player that was playing the best on the entire BYU football team, the BYU defense was great throughout the entire game. Mark Collins had a big interception late. Like, there were guys who were playing really, really good. There was not a single player on the 33 of the 33 players that go out onto the field, whether that be through special teams or on offense or on defense, that was playing better to that point in the game than LJ Martin. And to not even give him an opportunity to punch it into the end zone is banana land.
Trevor?
And you know why that's an issue, Hunter? Because doesn't that sound a little bit like a game that happened last year? Like Aiden Robbins, goal to go from the 1-yard line. Like, it's just, when will we learn? Like, I
thought you were going to talk about Marshawn Lynch, Super Bowl Patriots, and I was like, that game actually great one. One of my favorites.
So,
like, here's the thing, is I don't know assigning percentages, like initially knee-jerk reaction, I'm with Hunter, and I want to put him more on Roderick. But I go back to Oklahoma. Kalani said in the postgame, like, we told him to hand the ball off, and he threw it. Like, I'm
about to make a name for myself.
And we learned, and we also learned that and again, I'm not going to question the play call itself, the pitch on 3rd and 6 at the end of the game. Like, that audible itself was fine. but Jake audibled out of whatever the original play call was, which tells me that he has some autonomy to change the play. And somebody out there, LJ, you've been on this podcast before. You're humble. You're a great guy. Look people in the eye and say, give me the dang ball. Like, that's what needs to happen, right? Jake wants to throw the touchdown. I'm glad that we have a quarterback that's confident and he wants to go make a play. But this, like, run the ball.
I feel like, so here's my, again, more counters to this.
Counter to the counter to the counter to your counter.
Is this Floyd Mayweather against Floyd?
And then there was no counters in that fight.
And this is a ground.
Did we lose Joe? I'm going to filibuster while Joe's frozen.
Counter, okay. Leading in.
Joe's internet's countering.
Did I lose you?
He's back.
Sorry.
While Joe regains internet, I will say.
Can you hear me?
There is yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
I started a filibuster while you were gone, so I'm just going to finish the point. To Trevor's point, where it's like, obviously Retzloff on that 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, you audibly can hear him yelling, kill, kill, kill on the TV broadcast. And they changed the play. Now, former BYU lineman, and I think he spent like 10 years in the CFL, Riker Matthews. So he knows ball. On Twitter, because Ben was like, what was the original play call? He came and said that his guess is that that was the play call the entire time. And kill, the only thing was changing the direction in which they were going. So like we don't know that.
Roderick alluded to that. Was he said that play should have been run to the far side, and Jake called it to the short side.
But to Trevor's point, like that does illustrate whether it was changing the play completely or changing the play direction, which seems like it was direction. But to Trevor's point, it does show that like Jake has some control in this offense, and any good like offense is going to be that way. Like Kyle Shanahan for the 49ers, like got really mad at a reporter this week for asking about this, talking about Brock Purdy with the 49ers system, where it's like, yeah, like every like quarterback goes up there and either like has an ability to audible or has 2 plays called before, they break the huddle and get to the line. And then once they see the defense, they establish which play they're going to call. So like 100% Trevor, yes, Jake has some say in the offense. And I do agree that it's like, if you're LJ Martin, and going back to the first half scenario, he's never going to do this because he's a team guy and he's not going to be, a Terrell Owens or a Stephon Diggs or whatever other like diva wide receiver you want. Running backs aren't like that, right? Like they're hard nosed. They're going to do whatever job they're asked to do. But it is like, man, like get in the huddle and be like, give me the rock, right? Like I'm running all over this defense. Let's feed the hot hand. But again, he's like a 19-year-old true sophomore, quiet kid already. Love him to death. He was awesome on the podcast. Just guy who likes running through what does Marshawn Lynch say? Run through a MFer's face. He likes 2 things, running through MFer's face and watching Star Wars. And he's watched all the Star Wars. So like he's awesome player, but he's not ever going to be the guy that's going to go into the huddle and be like, don't care what the play call is, give me the ball. So it goes back to the coaching, like feed your workhorse back, feed the guy that's gotten you to this point, feed the hot hand, like whatever cliche you want to use, give the ball to LJ Martin. For goodness sakes, what are we doing?
So you guys ready for a stat that's going to make you sad? On the season,
these other stats not made me sad.
On the season, LJ Martin has 4 carries in goal-to-go situations all year.
He should get that on one possession. He should have gotten that on one possession.
All 4 have gone for touchdowns.
How many has he had?
Oh, you're right. That made me sad.
In conference play since after the Wyoming game. How many touches?
This isn't that granular, but it's probably all. I mean, I
feel like 2 of them were against SIU.
He probably had 2 against SIU, but like
I'll look it up.
Like Hinkley Rapati seems to be. Let's see. So Hinkley Rapati has 14 carries in the red zone this year. to LJ's 17. So it's, I don't know, like Hinkley Ropati seems like lately Hinkley Ropati has seemed to be the red zone back more than LJ, which again, I think Hinkley's done a good job. But here was the original counter to like Jake does have that power. And it kind of feels like we're talking about like, why are we throwing in goal to go situations when you have such a great running back coming into the game? Jake Retzloff inside the 10 in goal to go situations was 7 for 8 with 7 touchdowns. Like he has been a machine in the in goal to go situations this year.
How many of those were goal line fades?
Exactly. Like, but that's the thing. Horrible play call, not playing to Jake's strengths. But like, in terms of like, do I trust? Like, again, I've seen some takes that maybe I'm building a straw man, but takes like, you know, A-Rod, you can't trust Jake in the red zone to make a play. Yes, you can. He, again, 7 for 8, 7 touchdowns in goal to go situations this year. That's awesome. Like that is a over 350 passer rating. That's incredible. I never need to see him throw a goal line fade again, but the idea that like every time we get in goal to go situations, we need to run the ball now. I think that BYU has a lot of great options inside the goal line. Like I have no issue with A-Rod calling a pass play on first and goal. I have no issue with him calling a run play on first and goal, as long as that pass play is not an end zone fade. So that's kind of where I go on the 3rd and 6. I have no problem with Jake checking or saying kill or checking the play to a certain side, because Jake has been awesome this year in those kind of pre-snap decisions. It's unfortunate that all of those mistakes came to a head in one game. And that's ultimately why BYU lost. Now, looking forward, if we're going to start talking about Arizona State, I actually leave the game more confident in the offense, just because everything that they showed against Kansas was fixable. Like this wasn't an SMU. This wasn't a Utah where the offense could not move the ball except for like 1 or 2 drives. BYU moved the ball on pretty much every single drive that they had. Like the offense isn't broken. It's not like they don't have talent or like the offensive coordinator is completely incompetent. They just haven't been they just didn't execute in the red zone this week.
Depends on who you ask.
Sure.
I mean, and it's not any of us on the podcast,
but like, again, I just,
that are
for sure. I just think like not every offseason requires blood sacrifice. I keep saying like Kalani is the guy, Jay Hill's the guy, Kelly Papinga's the guy, A-Rod's not the guy. Well, 2 years ago, we were all talking about A-Rod being 100% the guy, with Tuiaki being not the guy. Like every BYU team needs some kind of weak link to blame any losses on, which this loss, again, 100% on the offense, not going to say anything different. BYU's offense was also the reason they beat UCF, Oklahoma State, that first half performance against Baylor. Those were all game. Arizona, BYU put up 34 points. Like BYU's offense hasn't been playing bad this year. And they've won games just like the defense has. So like, of course, I would say the offense is the weak link on this BYU team, but it's not like the defense has been a juggernaut the entire year. It's not like Jay Hill didn't have 100 and something ranked defense last year. Like we can't with
Tuiaki recruits, but yeah.
Right. Like not even the difference between, like, and again, people have called me out for saying, well, weren't you on like the Tuiaki train for too long? I was, because the results warranted it. Like BYU's defense in 2021 shut down Arizona State, a team with Jaden Daniels and Ricky Pearsall. BYU shut down that team with one of the, like, and then as the season went on, it was a horrible defense. Then 2022 was awful and he got fired, and I was all for that. But like there was no statistical reason why he needed to be fired after 2021. Does that, like, that seems reasonable to me. And right now, with the season's worth and a 5 years worth of data on Aaron Roderick, I don't see the argument for firing him at this point. And the reason to fire Tuiaki in the first place was because his recruiting was so poor and the effort was so poor. the offense has been recruiting great. We just committed 3 4-star offensive linemen. We have a 4-star receiver coming in this year.
Thanks, Coach Fessy and Coach Woods.
Right, but we can talk quarterbacks, but like somehow BYU always seems to have an above average quarterback. Like Zach Wilson was great, Jaron Hall was great, Baylor Romney was great, Keaton Slovis, not his fault. Offensive line was absolutely terrible last year, and he turned Jake Retzloff into the worst quarterback in all of the Power 5 into one of probably, I would say, the 30 best quarterbacks in college football. So we can criticize the recruiting all he wants, but when rubber meets the road, like Utah is signing 4-star quarterbacks every single year. None of those quarterbacks have combined to throw for as many yards as Jake Retzloff has this year. So it's like, how bad can the recruiting be really when everything he touches turns into a top 30 quarterback?
I don't think there's a single soul on earth that would knock Aaron Roderick's quarterback development and his, how capable he is of that. I think there's a real question to ask about his recruiting at the quarterback position. Again, like I've made it known that like, how do you send back-to-back guys to the NFL and then you like
totally
whiff on every single high school recruit quarterback you brought in since then, and the top guys in your own state are going elsewhere. Like that, those guys should be BYU guys. But to his credit, like once he does get a quarterback in, as if they're the right guy, like he does develop them well and better than a lot of other coaches out there. It's just the shortcomings everywhere else. And Joe, like what you're talking about, like the results are still there. My car, I gave you a car analogy already in the text. I'll give you another one right here. Because I'm not going to let Trevor corner the entire analogy market.
Fair.
If my car is running fine, but the check engine light is on, that doesn't mean I should ignore the check engine light. Like the warning signs of, hey, there's something that needs to be fixed here still exist. And despite the on-field result of BYU winning games, like you talk about the BYU offense, they probably won the UCF game. I'd say Baylor and Arizona were 50-50 splits. Like the offense won the first half of Baylor, the defense won the second half, because the offense could not move the ball in the second half of Baylor game, and we needed a Crew Wakely interception to beat a bad Baylor team. The Arizona game was just domination from first snap to final whistle on both sides of the ball. Again, it was a defensive score at the end that puts BYU over the 40-point mark for like the first time in years against a FBS opponent. But then you have games where it's like the Utah game, defense won you that game. Kansas game, BYU defense kept you in that game. SMU game, BYU defense won you that game. Like there's multiple instances of just defense single-handedly winning you football games. There's not any instance of that, with maybe the exception of Oklahoma State. Not maybe.
It's 100%. Like BYU scored on every possession in the second half. But like
that's the exception.
I would say that's like BYU's defense is, but I would say it's 3-1 because like every other game, BYU's offense and defense, I feel like has been pretty equally yoked. Like SIU, Wyoming, Baylor, Kansas State. I would say in all of those, like but BYU, like we're talking about we're talking about red zone execution here and how that's the big flaw of the BYU offense. BYU was perfect in the red zone against Kansas State. Like
but that was that. I mean, BYU.
But we're talking about situational play calling. Like
if momentum's quantifiable, like BYU had every ounce of momentum.
Right.
And it was the defense that was getting turnovers, interceptions, and fumbles, and you had a special team score and a defensive score, like all those things. I would say that's a BYU defense win.
Right. Then I would say that BYU
the offense could not move the ball until the defense scored a touchdown.
So we have what is BYU 9-1. So we have what we'll call it 3 games that they were equally yoked, or sorry, 4 games they were equally yoked, 3 games the defense won, and then I would argue that BYU's offense won the UCF game because looking at UCF's metrics on offense, UCF was averaging like 6.2 yards per play. BYU's defense could not stop UCF's offense. BYU ran up the score on them because BYU's offense was always on the field and UCF's defense and UCF's offense wasn't. So like in terms of complementary football, I'm not sure there's a team in the country that plays better complementary football than BYU. Like it's not like the defense has been carrying the offense all season. There's been plenty of moments where the defense hasn't been on their A game, where the BYU offense needed to execute, and they did. And in every game, including this one, when BYU desperately needed a drive to get into scoring position or else they lose the game, BYU has gotten into scoring position every single time. And so I don't think I just think this was a bad game. Like it just all the mistakes that you could have made, BYU made, but I don't see anything else in this season that says that there is a check engine light on for the BYU offense. I just don't see it because before BYU was 8th in the country in red zone scoring, and then they have one bad game in the red zone, and now we're talking about BYU, like Aaron Roderick can't call plays in the red zone. I don't see
one
that.
bad game though. It's not one bad game. And like, this is what we led off the whole discussion with and conversation with. It's a check engine light when anytime you're playing a average to above average defense, your offense is incapable of scoring. Again, like it's not one bad game against Kansas. It's a one bad game against Kansas. It's one bad game against Utah. It's one bad game against SMU. Like every single defense that they've played through these 10 games, that is, I mean, I don't even know if 75 is average. Like, but if a little bit below average to above average, the BYU offense is 15 points, 13 points, 18 points. If you take away, the defensive scores and all the crazy stuff that they did against Kansas State, like the offense, when it was putting together an actual drive, couldn't do that. So it's not just like the one bad game in the red zone against Kansas. It's like every single game this year against a good defense, they, for whatever reason, need to be carried by the defense.
Sorry, Trevor. We're totally just
this is great.
Going
I
on
love this.
Trevor's the mediator.
I've already. You guys, I'll have my moment here in a second. You guys go ahead. This is great.
He's ready. He's stewing. He's got this one thing. He's just like, I can't wait to.
But yes, every time, like to your point, like when BYU plays a top 75 defense, the points haven't followed, and I agree with that. What about? But like it's not like BYU's defense hasn't had horrible performances against horrible offenses. Like Oklahoma State is one of the worst offenses in the entire country, one of the worst rush offenses in the entire country. That was the only game that Ollie Gordon even looked semblance of human. Again, UCF ran all over them when they were actually on the field. What was the other? Utah has by far the worst offense in the conference, and to BYU's credit, shut them out in the second half, but gave up 21 points in the second quarter. Like that's a horrible defense. So, but my point isn't to rail on the defense and show that the offense is good. I'm saying that no one's perfect. No one is going to have a perfect game every single week. BYU's defense hasn't had a perfect game every single week, and they've had really bad games against really bad offenses. When BYU shows up against a bad defense, they do what they need to do against a bad defense. And I would argue that BYU's offense, again, with the exception of 5 plays, did not fail against Kansas. It just so happened it was the 5 most important plays that they got an F on, and that's why we're sitting here arguing instead of celebrating that BYU's 10-0. But like, again, it's all fixable. It's not, the car's not totaled. We don't need to scrap it for parts. There's a check engine light on. Like, I think it's possible there's a check engine light on, but this isn't like Tuiaki level bad. This isn't fire anyone bad. This is, okay, BYU has something that they clearly need to work on if they want to reach their goals this season. And given that this game was the one game all season long where they've been under 60% in red zone scoring, I'm comfortable saying that this game was an anomaly.
See, and I'm not comfortable saying it's an anomaly because we've seen this same game play out 3 times now.
3 out of 9, like, again, 67% of the time you're having a great game.
But the other games were against the 110th ranked defenses. Like, we've seen it play out. It wasn't a one-time fluky thing. It's happened multiple times just this season. Let alone if you want to start going back further than that, which we won't because it was a totally different, BYU football team a season ago.
are we extending that same expectation to every part of BYU's team, or are we just saying it to the offense because we didn't expect the offense to be any good this year? It feels like we're being very selective in our criticism.
No, if the BYU defense every single time they came out against a good team, a good offense, absolutely crumbled. Then
but it seems to happen every time they play a bad offense. So like it's the
those
same
are the hardest
thing
to prepare against. Again, like you point to the Utah one, like yeah, Utah offense not great, but like you held Utah to 21 points. Like that's and regardless of how bad an offense
hate being in this position.
That's still a pretty good and 0 points in 3 quarters. Like yeah, you had those 3 bad series, but again, second half they couldn't do a single thing. You know, Baylor, like they let Baylor's quarterback kind of run wild. And I think to that point in the season, everyone knew like the one Achilles heel was a running quarterback. But then they, in the second half, they got their stops that they needed to. They got the stop, gave the ball back to BYU. BYU commits a personal foul penalty, has to punt it back, and then Crew Wakely gets a game-winning interception. Like it's not the same. The defense has struggled at times, but it's not the same story every single time BYU defense faces a great offense. Counter because they played a really good offense in SMU and they held them out of the end zone into only 15 points. So like they have that to hang their hat on. I don't think BYU offense has something like that to hang their hat on to be like, yeah, we've struggled against these good defenses, but we played this one really good defense and we dominated. Every dominating game that they've had has come against a defense that's anywhere between 90th and 111th in opponents' points per game. So it's not. I need to see again, and we can. But
is the only
preview.
Is the only way to measure
ASU? Then that's maybe. But
is the only way to measure domination scoring points? Like, is that the only stat that you care about? I agree.
Points win.
I agree. Game. But BYU last year scored 38 points on Arkansas, but gained 250 yards of offense. Like, does that sound like a sustainable model?
I mean, it clearly wasn't.
Right.
But that's that's a season ago.
Can't be. I get it, but that proves that points can't be the only metric that we look at in evaluating an offense. Because again,
can. If it's consistent enough, you absolutely can.
But BYU defense. But the problem with that is you point to the Kansas State game as a bad offensive game because BYU only scored 24 points. Well, they only had 6 possessions. And it just so happened that all those possessions were inside the 20-yard line.
Kansas State has been their best offensive game against a good and I would say average defense. I think they're 50th. Like that's been their best performance. But I think if you're going to say that was a good offensive performance by BYU, you have to acknowledge it comes with the asterisks of your touchdown drive started at the Kansas State 27, Kansas State 28, Kansas State 34. Like you have to take that into the equation. But when you're looking at the whole picture, when you take a step back and you say BYU's played these 4 really good defenses, 4 not even really good, 4 average to above average defenses, how did they look in those 4 games? I think the answer is unequivocally they didn't look great. They looked good against Kansas State, but that's because the defense was consistently possession after possession, putting them in a position to look great. SMU did not look great. Utah did not look great. Kansas did not look great. And I think is enough of a trend. But they didn't.
They weren't great. They weren't great in the okay, by every other metric but points per game. By every other metric I get points.
You don't win football games on a spreadsheet and points per play.
I get it. Look, I get it. I get it. I get
it in the end zone.
I get it. But again, points don't always reflect how well an offense played. They just don't. Because BYU scored 38 points against Kansas, but I wouldn't say that they played an amazing offensive game.
Joe,
BYU gained more yards against Kansas.
Concede that it is not a reflection of a good or a bad offense in and of itself. It is a reflection on if you won or lost the game.
But to say that the offense was horrible.
The game,
but to say that the offense
on the scoreboard, not the PFF website.
I get it. Look, I get it. But to say that the offense was abjectly horrible, broken, engine light on, take it to the mechanic and throw it away. That is not what that game tells me at all. BYU was bad. BYU was bad at one thing. I have seen BYU be bad at everything in terms of, but again, if we're using this as something to predict how the offense is going to look going forward, this game should tell you that BYU is going to be able to move the ball on almost anybody. They're going to be able to put themselves in position to score against almost anybody. And I just don't think Jake Retzloff is going to throw an end zone fade interception every single time we're in the 5-yard line, because again, he is 7 for freaking 8 front goal to go situations.
He's done it every time.
Nothing about that Kansas game was sustainable going forward. It's just not. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills.
Past results are indicative of future
BYU lost
performance.
the game because they were situationally bad. They made 5 mistakes.
He froze. His
that
Wi-Fi
tells me
quit
nothing
out of
about
anger.
what BYU is going to be in the next
His
5
Wi-Fi
games.
quit out of anger. I understand, Joe. There are a million stats that you can pull,
but
that say
I get it,
that
but stats matter. Stats allow us to predict what's gonna try and help us predict what's gonna happen.
Stats do not matter more than the score on the scoreboard at the end to the final whistle.
That is by definition a stat, Hunter. A score is by definition
and
a
BYU
stat.
has not been good in that statistical category. Then.
But they have. They're like 18th in the country in points per drive.
Not against
18th in the country in points per drive.
And they're 76.
They played 3 good defenses all year.
4, and they're 76 in the country in offensive touchdowns per game. So if you want to pick stats
because
that you
they
care
have
about
like
versus
5
don't
drives
care
per
about,
game because the defense keeps scoring touchdowns.
But if you want to pull stats that you can care about or not care about, BYU's on par with Sam Houston State in terms of how many times the offense gets. That is true.
It's not true.
It's the stat. That's the stat. If you want to talk about stats, that's the stat.
Hunter, I get it. It is just not
give me the numbers and then discount the numbers that I give back.
Sam Houston. It is not true that BYU is on the same offensive level at Sam Houston. Just
in that category,
they're so for place. In that category, sure. You just threw away every stat that I had to offer you about BYU being a top 40 offense this year, and you're like, oh no, here's that one stat where BYU is close to Sam Houston, so that's the story because BYU scored.
I gave you.
What are we doing?
I gave you 4 stats: 76 in offensive touchdowns per game. 15 points against Utah, 13 points against Kansas, and 18 points against SMU. That's 5 stats for you. 5 stats.
It's all just points.
Yes, and ultimately that's what matters. I get the stats.
We were making that same argument last year after the Arkansas game where BYU scored 38 points, and we're like, points are all that matter. Clearly, it's not an indicator of future success. It's clearly not an indicator of future success.
But when it's a trend, when every defense that you've faced that is decent, you put up the same performance. Like that's now a pattern.
It's not. This is not the same performance as Utah. It's not the. Again, we can look at one stat all you want and every other stat. It's just not the same performance. Coincidentally they scored the same number of points.
Joe, scoring 18 points, 15 points, and 13 points is a trend.
But how you get there matters. How you get there matters. If BYU scores 18,
how you get there, you got there.
But if BYU scores 18 points in a game where they gain 30% of the yards that are available to them, that means BYU is not putting themselves into scoring position. And going forward, they were going to consistently not put up high points per game. If BYU is getting into scoring position and when they get to the red zone, they get unlucky or they just have a bad play and they put up 15 points. Well, I still feel confident that going forward, BYU is going to put themselves in position to score. That's the difference.
I don't care about how many times you get yourself into position to score. I care about how many times you score.
And BYU has been awesome at that all year. BYU is 8th in the country in red zone coming in.
Joe, there's clearly an issue when they play decent defenses. That's a fact. That is a fact. Whether or not they got into the position,
I want BYU to put up 45 on ASU so bad.
And that would be great.
Oh, man, I will be insufferable, Hunter.
It would be the first time all season that they did it against a defense that's top 75.
Wow.
So congratulations. Wow. That's a trend breaker, not a trend setter. There is a clear difference.
I love you, by the way. That needs to be said.
I love you too. This is what makes the podcast great.
There is
a difference. I do not care how many times you get in position to score. I care about how many times you actually do it. And call me old-fashioned. Call me old-fashioned. But I care about points more than I care about whatever.
You actually think that BYU played as well offensively against Kansas as they did against Utah?
I
or
think
SMU?
that ultimately it was a similar story of the BYU offense got the ball, got in a position to score, and then ultimately failed in the red zone and had to kick a field goal. Or
But that
ultimately
wasn't the
got
story against Utah.
that was
No,
they
BYU
scored
got
one
into scoring
touchdown
position.
against Utah.
BYU got into scoring position on 3 out of 11 drives. 3 out of 11 drives. That is a bad offensive performance. They just so happened to connect and score points on all of those opportunities. BYU got into scoring position inside the red zone on 5 out of 8 drives against Kansas. That is
what did they have to
objectively
show for it?
Right, I get it. BYU made
Nothing.
every mistake
13
possible,
points. They scored.
in the red zone. But the more opportunities you give yourself to score, the more you are going to score on average. That's the point. BYU had a really bad game against Kansas. No way does that tell me that they're not going to be able to do it going forward.
The stats you just told me are counter to that because they scored more offensive points against Utah with less scoring opportunities than they scored against Kansas. So if
BYU is Utah's level of efficiency, so if BYU is Utah's level, the Utah game's level of efficiency, and when they get into scoring position, they win that Kansas game 35-10. Okay. So, like, again, how you get there matters because it tells us that BYU's offense is it broken or is it not? Is BYU going to give themselves a chance to win the game, or are they not? I would not watch Utah's game and feel as confident in the offense as I am after watching Kansas. It's just not. Again, we can go back and forth on this all night long, but I just do not agree that the only like, again, at the end of the day, all that matters is the points on the scoreboards. I get it. I get it.
What matters? Poll on Twitter. What matters more, points or scoring opportunities?
But what matters most in predicting how the team is going to do going forward? Like, the entire purpose of this podcast is so that we can talk about what happened, so we can try and predict what's going to happen, right?
The entire point of this podcast for me is that I can go on more cruises with football players.
Fair enough. And make lewd shirts.
Hey, I don't know. That was all you. It's your podcast.
Awesome.
Trevor, what do you think? Chime in.
The deciding vote.
No, I'm not touching any of that. The truth is that
Trevor, what matters more, points or scoring opportunities?
What matters
is
irregardless if the car check engine light was on or not, or if we just needed a seasonal checkup before going into the winter. I believe that this BYU team stopped at Jiffy Lube this week, and that we are going to be fine.
Hell yeah.
That we are going to be fine going forward. I do. I believe it. I think this game against Arizona State, I think Arizona State's good, but I think that there are some matchup advantages for BYU. And I think coming in, there's going to be less pressure, believe it or not, for BYU because they lost. Not something we wanted to deal with, but something that we now have. I would much rather have lost to Kansas than Utah, and I would much rather lose to Kansas than Arizona State. So if we have to pick a place for that loss to take place, it happened. And it's over, and it's done. And I think that BYU bounces back this week, and I think the offense plays a big role in that. Whatever that looks like, tons of points, tons of yards, tons of both. Like, I feel good. I feel good about it. But the thing that I feel most good about, gentlemen, is this. Okay? And it's just yes or no questions. There's 3 of them. All right? Are we still first in the conference?
Yes.
Do we still control our destiny?
Yes.
Are we not independent anymore?
Correct.
Do points matter?
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, one more.
I have 3 more, and we're gonna set them off after every game that we win the rest of this season. Gosh dang it! Like, we're going to fix it. It's going to be fine. That was like the messiest one. Anyway,
chills.
Not the point.
Chills, head to toe.
I think you just single-handedly heal Hunter and mine's relationship.
You guys, shut up. You guys were fine.
Fractured.
You guys were fine. Arizona State's red zone offense, not good. Like 98. Okay, like BYU's defense should be able to keep them out of the end zone, statistically speaking. Total defense. What did I put in here? Red zone defense. Utah and Kansas both top 35. Like that's what they do. They stop teams from scoring in the red zone. They do that well. Arizona State, not as good. Like this is a team that is going to come in fired up. This is a team that is going to come in wanting to score touchdowns. And I think that this is a great test of, okay, you're not playing horrible defenses, but you're not playing the best red zone defenses in our conference either. What are you going to do about it? Because I think this is an indicator of how Houston will go. I think this is an indicator of how the conference championship game will go, because I believe that we're going to get there. I feel that good. So we're going to be fine. My cousin is going to suck so bad on Saturday, and it's going to be glorious to watch. But we're good. I think this is a team that has taken accountability all season. This is a team that has picked each other up when they've fallen all season long, and they took one to the chin and they fell down. But the good news is it's a 12-round boxing match, and we lost one of the rounds, but we still have chances to take the belt. Like that's where we're at. We're not independent anymore. We're in a conference. Our loss hasn't sunk us. And if we were to take a loss, we did it in the perfect spot. Like, let's go. Take over Tempe. Hashtag take over Tempe. We're going to be fine.
I will say I'm glad they lost this week and not last week, at least.
Yeah.
One silver lining.
Somehow, I almost feel more confident in BYU winning this week because, one, I think there was some tension surrounding the undefeated season, and that's always just kind of hanging over your head. And so, like, at least from my perspective, I figured that BYU was going to lose at some point. And so every week it just kind of went in with this tension of like, okay, is this the week they blow it? And now that they blew it, I feel confident that this team is going to get right. Like, Hunter, you brought up in years past that a loss kind of triggers a losing streak. BYU very rarely loses one in a row. I feel differently about this team. I think last year going 5-7 was the best thing to happen. Like going 5-7 for this program was better than going 6-6 and going to a bowl game. I think losing to Kansas is going to be better for BYU's season than another close win against Kansas would have been, because again, I think BYU was thinking that they were just kind of a team of destiny and could show up and win with only half an offensive effort, at least on the offensive side of the ball. And that's where Chase Roberts said it after the game. It's like, we got to go out here and beat people by 30 points. We got to stop thinking that we can rely on these miracle drives. And I think that was a little bit of shade to his offensive coordinator. At least that's how I would have read it, because again, you can't expect to blow out teams. You can't expect to get these style points. You like to our point about scoring opportunities and BYU being really good about getting in the red zone, because they're really good at getting to the red zone. I want BYU to have as many drives as possible, because that means that they're going to have more opportunities to score points. And I think they're going to be able to do that against Arizona State. Arizona State is a really good football team. I think there's been a lot of hand wringing because they beat Kansas State. I think there's a lot of hand wringing. Like ASU is kind of what BYU has been this year with, I guess I just don't think they're as good. if that makes any sense. Like Arizona State has had a lot of one-score games. They haven't really blown out anybody. They had a tight one against Cincinnati. I think they ended up losing that game. They had
Sam Levitt in that game though.
Right. They had a close win against UCF at home. Mostly because UCF decided to throw a pick six with 30 seconds left to go in the first half, and they won that game by 4. I don't see Arizona State as this dominant team that BYU needs to fear. I think BYU's defense showed out really well against a much better Kansas offense than what they'll face against Arizona State this week. I do disagree with Hunter that I think BYU's red zone execution last week was an anomaly, and they're going to be able to move the ball well and actually come through on these red zone scoring drives.
This game is the season. Like it
Right.
is. Like, like if you can't
like winning, you're in.
back,
like really, it's winning, you're in the Big 12 championship.
Winning, you're in, especially with Houston coming senior night, LAS last week of the season. Lose, I think situationally, if you lose this game, you're obviously behind Colorado in the Big 12 standings. But I think because Iowa State has 2 losses, Kansas State now has like 3. So you'd be tied with Kansas State.
They're out.
Kansas State is essentially out. It'd be BYU and Iowa State, and I think Iowa State has to play Kansas State. I'm not sure how the tiebreakers would work between BYU and Iowa State. Like, I don't even want to get into that and have that be part of the discussion because it's just BYU has to win this game. The vibes, if BYU loses 2 straight, now you're going into Houston, win or lose, and go to the Big 12 championship. Like, the vibes just won't be where they need to be going into that game, especially if Colorado continues to win out, because I'm a big believer in, teams that are hot versus teams that are not. And I think it showed itself this last week against Kansas a little bit, where it's like BYU had kind of sleptwalked a little bit, and, against UCF to some degree. They definitely sleptwalked against Utah, and Kansas, meanwhile, was getting really hot, and they had just had a dominating win against Iowa State, and they came in, believing that they could win. I'm a little worried that that's the similar thing that's happening with Arizona State, because Arizona State is coming in hot. They just had a huge win. They're going to be fired up. They're going to have all the confidence in the world. It's a home game for them. Their coach is, saying all the right things during the weekly pressers. Meanwhile, BYU's coming in after a disappointing loss and kind of on the downward trajectory. But to Trevor's point, like BYU, and it's the beautiful thing about now being in a conference, and it's a beautiful thing about the 12-team playoff especially, is that one loss does not absolutely tank your entire season. And if BYU was in the SEC, they could have 5 losses and still be in the playoff conversation, apparently. But one loss on BYU's resume does not tank their season. They can still win out. I think if you win out, you obviously go to the Big 12 championship game. If you win that game, you're in the playoff. We'll see, because now they're behind Boise State, which it's not the top 4 Power 4 conference champions. It's just the top 4 highest ranked conference champions. So I think BYU's got to not only win the next 3 games to make it into the playoff, but they've got to absolutely dominate the next 3 games, because you want to jump Boise State so you can get that round 1 bye. Obviously, silver lining of not doing that is a home game at LES in freaking December. Come on, dude. Like, imagine like ending on a high note, as Washington Capitals' Tom Wilson is now fighting in the game against Utah Hockey Club. So I'm going to watch that while I'm talking. Like, as crappy as it would be to lose out on a bye and a Rose Bowl berth, hello, friends up north. If BYU is hosting Iowa or Ohio State, Tom Wilson absolutely destroyed in that fight. Imagine BYU hosting Ohio State at Lavelle Edwards Stadium in a college football playoff game in mid-December. Would absolutely rock. Would be so sick. So I think either way, like, BYU still has the potential to have a really, really, really special season. You just really got to handle business this week in Tempe. And I think, to your guys' points, like, they have the talent and they should be able to do it. Just make sure that Kansas is a wake-up call and not the start of a losing streak, as it's typically been in years past.
I don't know. I feel good about it. I can't explain it. I just feel good about it. I think this BYU team is different than in years past. Predictions. I am going to say BYU 28, Arizona State 24. And my hot take is BYU is perfect in the red zone, scoring touchdowns.
I like that. I'm going to say
so only 4 scoring opportunities,
but only 7 drives. So.
31-21, and Sam Levitt has thrown 4 picks all season. I think he has 2 Saturday.
If this game was a week later and Trevor had the opportunity to put laxatives in Sam's Thanksgiving food at the old Levitt family Thanksgiving party, I'd feel better than I do about this game. But even with that, I'm going to say BYU defense. I'm going to stick with my boys. I'm going to say they're going to get either a defensive or special teams touchdown, and I'm going to say BYU wins 31-21.
Oof. Let's
and then
go.
I'll say
don't feel good about it and still predicting a 10-point win. I love that.
Well, it's mind or heart over mind.
It's so hard. It's so hard predicting these games because, like, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, like BYU's defense, like 100%, they're gonna keep Arizona State's offense in check, like 21 points max. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, I think BYU's offense is going to be really good, but somehow I think the game is still going to be close. So it's a lot of different thoughts going in my head at this point. But I like both of your guys' predictions better than mine.
Either way, Cougs by a billion.
Fun times, man. Vibes are still good. 9-1. Pager tiding.
We haven't even talked about Yago Devin and BYU basketball. That'll be in a few weeks, but
we don't talk about things that are good. It's more interesting to talk about things that suck. You don't get me riled up over things that are good.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. Like, the best podcast is when there's at least some turmoil. Like when BYU basketball is elite with a potentially top 5 NBA draft pick leading the team and undefeated, and the BYU football team is undefeated. It's like, what reason is there to have debates?
Boring. Thanks for
Cougs
keeping it interesting, Cougs. Go Cougs.